you. Thank you so much. So this is work in progress, taking forward my very vast research on obstetric violence. So I'm trying to do here like a combination about it. Okay, so feminist perspectives on how and why obstetric violence happens occupy a central place in the recent research on the subject. What is still missing from the research, however, and demands to be studied, is a link between the female body, especially the female birthing body, as grotesque and monstrous, and obstetric violence as a tool for domesticating and cleaning that body. Looking at the birthing body and the phenomenon of obstetric violence through the lenses of theories of the grotesque, themselves connected to theories of dirt, disgust, the abject, and the monstrous, and Crip phenomenologies that discuss disability, disorientation, and abnormality as emancipatory spaces rather than spaces to be avoided or escaped from, will allow us to illuminate the ways in which obstetric violence is understood and even offer new practical ways to tackle it. Okay, so obstetric violence, violence performed against women giving birth in medicalized settings, has been widely recognized as a structural phenomenon affecting innumerable women globally and systematically, and one that is in urgent need of being addressed and solved. Lately, even official global organizations such as the World Health Organization and the UN have released clear statements about obstetric violence, calling for immediate action on the part of countries and medical institutions to tackle the problem of pervasive obstetric violence worldwide. Research on the subject has grown exponentially over the last decade, mainly in the fields of health and social sciences. One of the main findings of this research is that obstetric violence constitutes gender violence, not just medical violence. Thus, because it is gender violence, research from the perspective of feminist theories has proved to be crucial in trying to understand the reasons behind the phenomenon and the myriad ways in which it harms birthing women while making itself almost invisible, normalized to the point that it is often unrecognizable as violence. Feminist phenomenology and feminist epistemology have been used to try to disentangle the mechanisms that nurture and enable obstetric violence in the form of practices that seem normal, necessary, or inevitable, both in the eyes of medical staff and more pressingly, even in those of birthing women themselves, that they have made it normal, necessary, or inevitable, both in the eyes of medical staff and more pressingly, even in those of birthing women themselves. Feminist phenomenology has contributed to showing how the birthing body is a rebellious, subversive body, a prototype of the I can, a potent embodied subjectivity, and one that frequently behaves in ways considered unfeminine according to patriarchal standards because of the power, strength, loudness, and expansiveness that it displays. Obstetric violence, thus, has appeared to be the tool through which these bodies are put back in their place. Through obstetric violence, the subversive body that is characteristic of labor is dominated, silenced, restricted. In other words, it is made feminine again, sometimes through severe violence, even reported as torture. Laboring bodies, however, are not just strong, loud, powerful bodies. They are also vulnerable bodies in need of solidarity and care, through not in the form of paternalistic impositions. They are also bodies that belong to the abnormal due to their changing form and capacities. They are unexpected, sometimes disoriented, ambiguous bodies that can be suggestive of monstrosity. Birthing subjects are irremediably, clearly embodied, and their embodiment is present as fleshy, smelly, and replete with fluids, dirt, or contamination, frequently including feces and urine, and always including blood. And as such, they are surrounded by shame and fear. One of the most illuminating studies of birth as dirty is Callaghan. Callaghan explains the history of birth as a dirty zone, along with the social, political, and cultural function, both past and present, that is served by defining birth that way. The strengthening of the power of the medical establishment and its absolute control over birth. The medical establishment, Callaghan shows, has deemed birth to be dirty, mainly so that the establishment can be the one to sanitize it. to take on the primary responsibility for making it hygienic. While an important part of this history is that, at least in its beginnings, this medical attempt to sanitize birth actually increased infections and death. This is also how the medical system displaced midwives from the birth scene, by declaring them to be dirty. In short, Callaghan argues, what is behind the need to cleanse birth is power relations. The diminishment of midwives' power, and even more critically, the diminishment of the power of the laboring woman. Birthing bodies are thus prototypes of Kristeva's abject, and therefore frequently escaped from both by the medical staff and by laboring women themselves, because they are grotesque bodies in need of being cleaned, sanitized, and saved from their own monstrosity. The birth activist and home midwife Jacqueline Bailstrup writes, for instance, as long as the dangerous, sickly female body appears scarier to us than the vast number of serious injuries caused by labor interventions, patriarchy's medicalized imprisonment will falsely appear to appear safer to childbearing women. Thus, I argue, obstetric violence cannot be truly understood without addressing the grotesqueness of laboring bodies, their inherent uncanniness and unexpectedness, and the challenge that all of this poses to the ambitions to standardization, normalcy, order, cleanliness, and predictability that are paradigmatic of medicalization. A new phenomenological analysis examining these features of birthing bodies is much needed in order to add a different perspective to the research into the causes behind the phenomenon of obstetric violence and shed new light on these investigations. A Crip phenomenology, a phenomenology that challenges the conceptions of normal, abnormal, and able-disabled bodies and places, will create space for a novel discussion on obstetric violence and the strategies for tackling it. Although birthing bodies in the sense, this is Cindy Sherman's work, although birthing bodies in the sense that they perform a rather normal physiological function are not abnormal, they are abnormal compared to what is expected from normal bodies in everyday life. Birthing bodies are grotesque. They change in form, they are fluid, expansive, and both comic and monstrous. Their openings are exaggerated and dynamic. They are bodies that go out and into the world and that receive or meet the world through their orifices. Bakhtin describes grotesque embodiment precisely in this way. Grotesque bodies are disruptive bodies par excellence, subversive bodies that challenge the norm, not always through strength or extraordinary capacities. Frequently, it is through the opposite. They are hybrid bodies that often include the formations that create disabilities, such as limbs and body parts that are too big or too small, disproportional and thus dysfunctional, or that present a mixture of incompatible embodied features. Different theories of the grotesque body as transgressive, mainly Bakhtin's, shall inform a novel analysis of the birthing body as challenging medical discipline and power, not by being an extraordinarily potent, able body, but in its character as a non-normative Crip entity. Through this analysis, the phenomenon of obstetric violence might be understood in a different light, as the very predictable response of the medicalized system to the unbearable anxiety caused by the lack of control, dysfunctionality or disorientation, and contamination that grotesque birthing bodies bring with themselves. Within the field of disability studies, Crip phenomenology has recently emerged as a form of critical phenomenology that looks at the experiences of disabled bodies and subjects and of people living with physical or mental disabilities. This new phenomenological research does not aim to recognize these bodies as pertaining to some new normal, that is to expand the notion of normalcy, so to speak, in order to include all bodies by bringing them to the same table, but rather to emphasize dysfunctionality, sometimes even presented as a kind of monstrosity, instead of erasing or diluting it. The purpose is to argue for the disabled body and the disabled subject as possessing certain virtues, and to analyze disability as a condition from which new insights into experience and the lived world might emerge. Bringing Crip phenomenology to the fore can contribute to the depathologization of the birthing body and promote a reading through which it can be approached as an emancipatory space. Instead, one of the main goals of Crip phenomenology has been to embrace disorientation, to argue for the ethical, aesthetic, and epistemic value of being lost, of encountering others in the midst of confusion and uncertainty. I shall argue that such an attitude towards the lived experience and the lived world might aid in resisting obstetric violence. A medical system that even partially, even critically adopts the idea of disorientation as a space in which it is possible to linger, and that incorporates other important reflections on the potential of illness offered by Crip phenomenology, might thereby become better equipped to deal with the grotesque birthing body and less prone to attempt to tame or control it through violence. This attitude could also help bringing subjects to embrace their own disoriented birthing body instead of fearing it, and as a consequence, becoming complicit in their own submission to medical objectification. I believe that the introduction of insights from Crip phenomenologies into the field of birth studies may open up a myriad of new ways of looking at what happens in medicalized birth settings as a consequence of fear and anxiety in face of the unexpected, the disorienting, the grotesque, and the monstrous. This could offer an important approach to questions regarding trans men and gender non-conforming subjects given birth, as well as disabled laboring bodies, for whom the descriptions of grotesqueness and monstrosity might apply even more strongly than for more mainstream birthing bodies. Obstetric violence toward disabled subjects, trans men, and other gender non-conforming subjects given birth has not been investigated. This project shall function as an invaluable opportunity to approach these pressing issues, mainly through the insights provided by Crip phenomenologies. Another phenomenon that is worth investigating through this prism is that of obstetric violence toward laboring subjects when the fetus is no longer alive. That is, people experiencing late miscarriages or undergoing abortions. The presence of a dead fetus, I hypothesize, redoubles the monstrosity and grotesque character of birth. It adds to its liminality and uncanniness and might be responsible for producing even more shame, anxiety, and loathing on the part of both the medical staff and the birthing subject themselves. The attempt to control these may in turn provoke even more blatant violence. The grotesqueness and abnormality of the female body have already been discussed by grotesque theorists and at length by several feminist scholars. Women's bodies have been recognized as paradigmatic of fluidity, viscosity, blurred and leaky limits, and boundaries, porosity and contamination, and of liminality in general. Women's bodies are thus always surrounded by shame. Already in her early and classic essay on the monstrous body and its place in posthumanism, Shieldrick describes the female body as a broken, disruptive body that threatens the masculine subject and is responsible for provoking anxiety by being a transgressive signifier that challenges the norm and the norm. Shieldrick writes, women are the non-subject, the excluded, the embodied, the monstrous. Women's bodies paradigmatically and by elision, women themselves exemplify an indifference to limits evidenced by such everyday occurrences as menstruation, pregnancy, lactation, and such supposedly characteristic disorders as hysteria. Women are out of control, uncontained, unpredictable, leaky, they are in short monstrous. Some feminist studies of reproduction and reproductive injustice have discussed the monstrosity of female embodiment as critical for understanding the various wrongs committed against women in medicalized systems dealing with reproductive issues, including in pregnancy and postpartum. However, the specific event of birth has not been thematized, even in works that extensively address women's reproductive bodies and monstrosity, such as Usher. Thus, detailed research into the grotesqueness of birthing bodies and the birthing process is still very much missing. I believe that a specific focus on birth is necessary and will provide new and original insights because I argue the birthing body is a doubly grotesque body. On the one hand, it is grotesque simply by being female, but in addition, the body acting in birth is replete with grotesqueness, even if we set aside its female character. I believe that this can be the basis for deep research on trans and gender non-conforming birthing people. Trans people are considered even more monstrous than women, and birthing redoubles their monstrosity. If the freakishness of birthing women can be explored and redeemed through Crip phenomenology, that research might help to construct a safe space for other birthing people as well. In order to discuss the birthing body as compatible with grotesqueness and monstrosity, I rely on the vast literature that has demonstrated that the laboring subject to be one in which fragmentation, fluidity, excessiveness, confusion, irrationality, dirt, uncanniness, and undecipherability rule. Various studies on the experience of birth show the birthing body as possessing these qualities, and they also show how difficult it is for the medical system and sometimes even for birthing women themselves to properly cope with and react to this embodied experience without shame, without a need to control this body, and to manage and articulate the experience and the body of birth, and without resorting to a clear, rational, unified, and unambiguous idea of the subject. I have like 1 minute, 2 minutes. So just for my last part. Okay, so about Crip phenomenology, far from trying to cure disorientation or normalize our lost subjectivities, Crip phenomenology suggests that these features are precisely what sustains human relations. The intersubjective relations of care and mutual protection necessarily derive from the recognition of vulnerability and disorientation, even if they clearly do not constitute the only response to those, given that people also respond to disorientation and uncanniness with oppression and violence meant to abolish those uncomfortable states. However, we can argue in favor of an ethical responsibility to respond to disorientation with compassion. Thus, this project aims to help create not spaces where birthing bodies, women's and others, will be oriented, but rather spaces that will be supportive of the experience and expression of such disorientation. Looking at the disorientation that is characteristic of laboring bodies and that accompanies the viewing of the experience of birth with awe instead of with fear and repulsion, may, I argue, bring about significant changes in how the medicalized system and birthing women relate to birth, hopefully contributing to a consciousness raising about both obstetric violence and the complicity of birthing women in their own submission, as well as about why and how to resist both of these phenomena.